right, so I'm sitting here with Ron Moore, who's the author of 5 books in reliability. And Ron, thank you so much for taking the time to
My
come and
pleasure.
talk with me today. I really appreciate it. And let me just kick things off by saying that you are a very respected leader in the reliability community. But would you mind taking just a second and giving us your definition of reliability?
Well, my definition is pretty simple. It's stuff works when you want it to. I know the definition according to SMRP and SAE and all those guys, and they're fairly technical, but stuff works when you want it to. And for maintenance, stuff's easy to fix.
Okay.
You know, so that kind of makes it easy for the guys on the floor to understand
Sure.
what reliability is about.
Okay, great, thank you. You know, it's sort of known out there that the industrial market's been a bit reluctant or reserved, I guess is a good word, about implementing reliability programs throughout the industrial base. What do you see as the biggest obstacle to implementing a good reliability program?
Well, reliability is a little bit like buying property. The 3 biggest things in property, of course, are location, location, location. The 3 biggest things on reliability are leadership, leadership, and leadership.
Okay.
And it really boils down to a fundamental lack of understanding on their part of what reliability brings to the table and the fact that it's not just maintenance. And there seems to be, for lack of a better phrase, profound ignorance, on their part.
Yeah.
That's not, they're smart people. They just don't understand the concepts and the principles around reliability.
Okay.
I'm ignorant about a lot of things. They just happen to be about this particular issue,
Okay. If you could give one piece of advice to an organization just kind of starting on this reliability journey, what would that advice be?
Well, I think probably the biggest thing that people need to do is get back to basics. There's almost every plant that I've been in, they don't do the basics particularly well, or they have variations in how each individual, each department, each function does what they do. So the basics around things like 5S, and it's more than sort, straighten. It's systematize and standardize so you sustain. It's standard work. Every shift operates the process the same way.
Sure.
Not lots of tweaking and that sort of thing amongst every shift. It's visual systems, so you make it easy for folks doing the work to see problems. It's 5 whys. Just ask them why 5 times. It's those kinds of things that people don't do particularly well, and you can use those things to engage the workforce. The leverage is in the thousands of people running the plants, not the CEO.
Okay.
But the CEO has to create the environment for them to do that.
Okay.
And generally they don't.
Yeah. So that brings up the next question. That's a perfect segue. Is senior leadership, and we've already mentioned, is the key. If you could talk with a CEO of a large organization, him or her, what would you suggest to them is the best way to provide leadership?
Well, they have to treat reliability much the same as they treat safety. And most CEOs that I know, they say, of course, that safety is a top priority, and they're actively engaged in that. They provide the systems, the measures, they provide the rewards, the punishment. They're active sponsors of safety. Well, I've got a lot of data that says if you aren't reliable, you won't be safe. And if they really believe in safety, they would believe in reliability. Moreover, what I've found is that if you have good reliability programs, which include design, operations, maintenance, procurement, it's a holistic approach. If you have that, you're probably going to see your maintenance costs go down by 10%, maybe even up to 30%. You're probably going to see your output go up by 10 to 20%. And the gross profit on that is just tremendous.
Sure.
And you get a bonus. You get a safer organization. So I make that point. I know one time we started a presentation to an executive president, and vice president and so on, the first slide was $150 million. That was the entire slide.
Wow.
You know, that got his attention.
Yeah, I bet.
So then after that, we said, well, let us explain where this number comes from and how you improve your performance by this amount. They did.
Wow, that's an amazing story. I want to shift for a second and talk about your experience. You were a past president of CSI,
Right.
and you have a lot of experience with reliability concepts, and you helped, I think, even develop the concept of reliability-based maintenance.
With Forrest Pardue and Ken Piety.
Okay.
Yep.
And later on, after establishing a very successful consulting practice, you wrote a couple of books on the subject, and you've brought those here today. I think Making Common Sense Common Practice presents the story of a new CEO or a new plant manager who's just starting out on his operational excellence and reliability journey. Would you tell us about the story behind developing Making Common Sense Common Practice?
Well, what I wanted to do with the book is to share my experience in working with quite literally hundreds of companies out there and use storytelling to outline some of the things they did in order to improve their performance. And so the story is fictitious, of course, but it's an amalgam of all of my experiences working with all these big companies around the world.
Okay.
You know, throughout Europe, Australia, Asia, and of course the U.S.
I have basically the same question about what tool when. If you could talk about the genesis of that, how it maybe differs a little bit from Making Common Sense Common Practice.
Well, it's somewhat of a sequel.
Okay.
You know, my publisher called me and asked me, to write another book, and I said, don't want to write another book. And they said, please, and I said, well, there are some problems out there. One of the things I observed is that all these tools, RCM, TPM, Six Sigma, RCA, what was happening was they either weren't successful at all, or alternatively, they would have some success for, say, 6 months to a year, and then the person in charge of that or leading that particular improvement effort would leave, and the improvements would disappear. So after giving that some thought and observing what I observed about people using those tools, and to be clear, I'm not an expert in any of those tools, okay? But I thought I'd put together my observations on our hierarchy of what works, when to apply it, how it works, and how it works best, and that sort of thing. And what I concluded was, if you have good leadership, good alignment, good teamwork, a good culture, any tool will work.
Wow, okay.
If you don't have that, no tool will work.
Okay.
So it's really about the culture, the environment, the leadership within an organization that makes a tool work. But there is a hierarchy of tools that I think works best. And it starts, as I said earlier, it starts with putting the basics in place to engage all your employees. Only about 30% in most companies, only about 30% of the employees are engaged. 50% are disengaged, and 20% are actively disengaged. They're
I have read the same studies on that, and the numbers are astounding.
Yeah.
That they're that large.
So if you start out with the basics, like going to your guys and saying, guys, we need to get this problem solved. What standards do you think we ought to put in place, and let them work it out? They have the ownership for it. And when they have the ownership, it's more likely to be sustainable. And then, of course, you put procedures in place and checklists and all that sort of thing. So if you start out with what's called Kaizen in the Japanese methodology, standard work, 5 Whys, 5S, visual systems, structured improvement time. That's a big one. Once a month, once a week, you need to set aside a block of time, half a day or a day, to work on something. Pick a machine, put together a cross-functional team, not a departmental team, a cross-functional team of guys to work together. And then you get that sense of teamwork. You understand more about what each other is doing, and you tend to empathize more and be more cooperative when you do that. So you start there, then you go to TPM. Oh, by the way, that first bit, those are the organizational enablers. They create the organizational readiness, and they solve about 80% of the problems that are out there. And then you go to TPM, your OEE measure, your operator care, your PM, PDM planning, and all that sort of thing. Then you go to RCA, RCM, and Six Sigma. And if you have all that, you'll have good supply chain performance. So that's the hierarchy that I've seen work. And I've seen if you start at the bottom of that hierarchy, not likely to be sustainable because you don't have the organizational readiness, the enablers, and you don't solve a lot of problems. Those one at the bottom of that hierarchy only involve maybe 3 or 4 or 5% of the workforce. The ones at the top of that hierarchy involve 90 to 95% of the workforce. There's the leverage.
Sure.
Now, I'm not saying you don't need those at the bottom. Of course you do. But you can solve a ton of problems with the basics. And it makes those other tools more effective and sustainable.